Across the West, established institutions are failing. Nowhere is this more evident than in the Church of England. Statistical projections put an end to the English Reformation in the UK by the 2030s, in Canada by the 2040s, and in America by the 2050s. Young people increasingly identify as nothing in particular on surveys of religion. As Western culture ditches its last vestiges of the old religiosity, why and how could some young people find themselves drawn to a faith in a dead God? What does it mean to search for transcendental beauty, truth, and goodness in our spectacular society of black mirrors? To discuss this topic, we have three experts on the philosophy of religion and contemporary England, which will be the microcosmic focus of our study. Catherine, Esme, and Alina, would you like to introduce yourselves?
So I'm Catherine. I do a PhD in political theory, and I'm a Catholic convert, but I've also been very interested in Islamic theology as well.
I'm Esme. I've recently graduated from SOAS in London, and I've been studying religion, culture, and society, but I have a particular personal interest in Islamic theology, mysticism, and also the dynamics of spirituality in a secular world, looking particularly at the internet and how new spiritualities are emerging on sites like TikTok.
So I'm Eleanor. The focus of my studies was the political economy and philosophy of Europe. I was raised as a low church Anglican and later became non-denominational Christian, and then I converted to Catholicism.
Okay, so that's actually very interesting, Alina. I guess we should begin with you because I've sort of framed the episode around the decline of the Church of England, but as many people, who pay attention to these things will know, the decline of Christianity in the West across the board is common to all denominations or all sects. While some people would want to point to evangelical charismatic growth in Africa or in the global South, as it's called, there seems to be a really precipitous decline in Christian belief in the Western world. And your story is actually very similar to my own. I mean, I was growing up as a kind of dissenting, nonconformist, evangelical Methodist. And as I grew older, it basically became untenable for me for a variety of reasons. What it took for me personally to really come back to the faith and to take it seriously was not only a matter of can Christianity be defended rationally, but can I actually live it? And I don't want to put too much weight on all of you to talk about your own personal lives, but just as a young man, it's very easy to get caught up in the cycle of drinking, easy sex, drugs, whatever. I mean, Nietzsche was basically right about Christianity as an ascetic religion. In our culture, to what degree does asceticism even make sense? To what degree is mysticism anything more than a pejorative or a kind of escapist fantasy? Why would you try to commune with an eternal God when you can just drop LSD or whatever? And I think that's a major contributing factor. I asked people on Twitter today, okay, what's up with the Church of England? Why is it in this decline? And the most common response that I got was, it stands for nothing. It has nothing to offer. There's nothing there. And when I reflect on, a couple of weeks, my son is going to be baptized by Russian Orthodox in central France. And Metropolitan Callistos Ware talks about this very clearly when he speaks about he was going, he met the Russian Orthodox in London and he started to ask questions. And at Oxbridge, he was talking to somebody who said, you can believe all that.
I'm going to see someone I've just mentioned, Archbishop Michael Ramsey, in 1957. He was Archbishop of York at that time, and my uncle and godfather was the ecclesiastical advisor to the Archdiocese of York, and he didn't think it a good idea that I should become Orthodox, so he said, go and see Michael Ramsey. And Michael Ramsey said to me, why do you want to be Orthodox? And being young and arrogant, I said to him, because I believe it is the true Church of Christ. And he then took the wind out of my sails by saying, I believe that too. And he developed the point. He said, I believe the Orthodox Church is the true Church of Christ in the sense that it has a fullness of faith and spiritual life not to be found anywhere else in Christendom. But, he said, God has put you in the Anglican Church, and he's put me there too, and therefore we have to try to live out our vision of orthodoxy in the church where we are. You are an heir, he said, to the Middle Ages, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, the Enlightenment. If you become Orthodox, you will be opting out for all of this from your own cultural situation. This is quite a persuasive argument, but as you see, it didn't entirely convince me.
And he said, well, why would I? And I think that's the question that sort of faces all of the entrenched institutional Christianities. Well, why would I?
Yeah, I think that hits the nail on the head in terms of representing the Anglican faith. I think people have referred to it, to the religion of England now in the late 20th, early 21st century as kind of Anglican multi-faithism, whereby anything can be believed in a sense. The era of dogma and doctrine as such are over. And I mean, obviously this started a long time ago with kind of the unhinging of minds from any kind of basis in objective truth. And so this is kind of inevitable, I suppose, that this is how faith has now materialized in much of the world as kind of a legacy of the kind of corruption of our minds through bad philosophy and other things. So that's been my experience, and that I rejected in meeting with Christ and believing in Christ and wanting to follow him. And as you say, follow him in a sincere way and hopefully an authentic way, even though I do so very imperfectly. But in wanting to do that, Anglicanism didn't offer me any of the resources to be able to pursue that authentic, ascetic pursuit of Christ and, deification almost that we're called to become more Christ-like. So it was really being nurtured through evangelicalism that sought the early church, and then that kind of nurturing time enabled me to find the Catholic Church, I believe is the objective truth. So that's my own kind of journey and how.
And before we leave on that, I think it's interesting that you talk about having this charismatic or dynamic experience within evangelicalism. And there seems to be this, I don't want to call it a trend, but there are certainly examples of people who go through evangelicalism as a kind of stage on life's way. But there seems to be this issue with evangelicalism where it can get you to this point of understanding that you need to change your life, that you can't just live according to the world. But once it gets beyond that point of conversion to saying, okay, well, how do I really live? It kind of draws a blank. And the people that I know that are the most sincere evangelicals are missionaries. And it kind of makes sense when you think about the system of evangelicalism, because, you are converted and now you're converting other people. And so in a sense, you're always staying in that moment of conversion, because, I'm converted and now I'm coming to Catherine, I'm coming to Esme, I'm coming to Alina. I'm bringing that moment to everyone that I know.
Yeah, rather than your own ongoing conversion, which I think obviously, the more ancient forms of Christianity help us to do more, to help us to have a lifelong conversion and to realize that, that instant that we become a Christian, we're not there yet, and we can't be confident. So that was a very big difference to get used to. I think I'm still somewhat in the evangelical mindset of, finding it easier to convert others than to convert myself.
So what was the jump for you between evangelicalism and Catholicism? I mean, yesterday, Alison Milbank was speaking at St. Bartholomew the Great in London about this sort of controversy within the Church of England about, whether or not the old parishes, the actual institutional local churches, are a hindrance to the faith. And as an outsider, I'm not here to judge the Church of England, but it seems like the leadership of that church are hell-bent on disemboweling themselves. Like they have a project of total destruction of whatever is left of their religion. And when you see somebody like Milbank speaking, she has a passion, she has a real care. There's something real there in her faith that is tied to that local community, that real experience.
So, for some years, the Church of England has totally capitulated to market values and managerialism. This can be seen as far back as Mission Shaped Church in 2004, and its embrace of the homogeneous unit principle for growth. In theory, our church operates a mixed economy of parishes and fresh expressions, now renamed mixed ecology to make it sound nicer. Moreover, since Mission-Shaped Church onwards, there has been a tendency to view the parish like some inherited embarrassing knick-knack from a great-aunt that you wish were in the attic. COVID has been an opportunity to expedite further the demise of traditional church, as in this statement from some senior clergy last year in the Church Times. This is the COVID situation. Being prevented from going to church might liberate us from our habitual routines to become church all over again, or perhaps for the very first time. Such rejuvenation may help to release us at last from the prison of our church building, which for many have become shrines to the past, which not only soak up energy and resources, but also perpetuate concepts of division and hierarchy, harmful to a mature understanding of who we are. Along with this denigration of our orders, our worship, and indeed our whole ecclesiology, our DNA, if you like, goes a draining of resources away from parishes. Chelmsford Diocese, for example, is to lose 60 posts in 18 months, with 40 more in the offing. And other dioceses plan their own cuts. The Church Commissioners are, however, doing quite well, with returns of 12.4% on investments last year, with 500 million extra to spend, likely to continue till 2025. Yet rural ministry is cut back ever more to the bone. And that's not to mention the eye-watering salaries paid to ever more managers at diocesan level linked to this mission strategy. We are at crunch time. Are we the Church of England with its reformed Catholic character, its sacraments, orders and liturgies, and its parish witness, or are we a nonconformist sect? There are hard decisions to be made in a church during a period of secularization and atheism.
You know, she kind of presented the debate within the Church of England as between, you know, evangelicals and the sort of reformed, Catholicism that she more represents. And I just wonder, you know, Alina, since you went from an evangelical to a Catholic, what was the real distance there? What was the difference?
Yeah, I also do know many, very believing Anglicans, and many of them, do reflect Christ very well in many ways. But ultimately, I didn't know, what does Anglican represent and what are its foundations. And once I started delving into it more, I just thought, the way it's heading, its trajectory is conformity with the world rather than conformity with Christ. And I didn't feel it was, offering me conformity with Christ. But as we see, with the decline in people willingly attending, it's not offering them anything. So I suppose, the difference has just been finding myself, at peace with a church that I feel is authentic and true to the deposit of faith that the apostles were given, and has not swayed from that.
And to be clear for the audience, I mean, I know that we have listeners who are non-Christian or whatever. The New Testament is very extreme when it says, do not love the world or anything in the world. Right? I mean, it's a very uncompromising view of life. And to actually live up to it is a kind of condemnation of ourselves. I mean, I certainly don't live up to it. And it's a problem for me every day that I try to fight. And I mean, I'm speaking to three women. I'm a man. I'm not going to pretend that our struggles and our sins and our difficulties are the same. But it's just a reality that the gospel asks. Many times in the gospel, the apostles turn to Christ and say, this is a hard teaching. This is a hard teaching. And when I think of so much of contemporary Christianity, there's nothing hard about it. It's just very easy. It's all very easy. And I think that is a kind of death knell for the institutional church, which, to be fair, I mean, I'm not here to condemn Anglicans, but they have made a deal with the devil of sorts. I mean, they're completely integrated into the state and society of England. So as goes the UK, so goes the Church of England. I mean, that's the reality. And I mean, they can't, to what degree can they be a prophetic voice in the wilderness, calling people to repent when their bishops are appointed by Boris Johnson or whatever. I feel like Catherine has something to say here.
Only really sort of total agreement. I agree with you almost entirely. When you talk about the fact that the apostles themselves turn around and sort of cry out, talking about how difficult this is, talking about the fact that it almost feels unsustainable to live this kind of life. The expectations are too difficult, are too brutal, require too much sacrifice, too much suffering, too much death to self, which really Christianity is in many ways. They even betray their savior. Their Christianity fundamentally and Abrahamic religions require self-sacrifice, require suffering. And that should stand in complete opposition to contemporary society in the West. Contemporary society in the West tells you or indoctrinates you or advertises you and sells you the fact that it doesn't really matter what's best. So there is no objective morality, there is no objective truth. If you feel inclined towards a certain ideology or way of living or whatever it might be, then that's perfectly fine, and you can very easily buy into that. And the second that
even more, you must participate, you must consume.
Yes, exactly. You must consume. That's it, exactly. And the second that stops feeling pleasurable, and it's not a question of feeling truly happy, of feeling sort of eudaimonic or like you're flourishing anyway. It's a question of when it stops being pleasurable personally, that's when it's fine. You just move on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. You just purchase the next item. You just buy into the next sort of semblance of theology, whatever it might be. And so I think what contemporary society needs is a church which stands in total opposition to this kind of thought. And as much as I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse, and as much as there are entirely very devout Anglicans who I personally think deserve better, the Church of England is very worldly. The entire point of our religion is that we are told to take up our cross, and taking up our cross doesn't mean that we do certain things which are a bit of a pain and make us a little bit uncomfortable, but ultimately we get some kind of reward because of it. It means a total kind of annihilation of ego, a total annihilation of the self. And the Church of England all too often is indistinguishable from the society in which it operates. And so I
mean, and it's not even the Church of England. You can go listen to the podcast, Who Killed Mars Hill, and you'll see that in American evangelicalism, you have even more rampant abuses. Mm-hmm. Every form of Christianity, as far as I can tell, is suffering from some degree of this problem. I mean, my own sort of adoptive tradition, Patriarch Kirill, go look up his photos with the wristwatches. It's not something that's totally foreign to any particular tradition. The Catholic Church is, last episode of Forums, we talked about all the issues going on with the Catholic Church. There's all kinds of issues going on. And I think, I was, not to bring this too much back to social media, but somebody, I think it was even John Milbank himself talking about the Church of England. I just said, if you would do communism as practiced in Acts chapter 4, every single parish across England would be filled. There'd be standing room only. But we don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the fundamental condemnation of Christianity, is that we don't live up to the gospel. We don't live up to the New Testament. At least I don't.
I think that I'm so sorry, Esme. I think that every single person falls short in Christianity in some ways. Who was perfect? Two. Each one of us is sinful. It requires, in my view as a Catholic, requires confession, requires sort of absolution. But the difference is, just as the apostles sort of fell short and the like, but they were always with Christ, and ultimately they were always sort of against the world, even if sometimes it was very, very difficult, and maybe they didn't feel as if they wanted to be. Maybe it wasn't pleasurable. If I'm with a church which fails in some ways, but ultimately truly believes and instructs me towards an objective truth and an objective good, I feel like that is for a reason, as opposed to maybe certain kinds of churches or denominations who seem to fail and fall short, as we all do, understandably, but consider that acceptable, even desirable, if it makes them more like the society they're in.
Catherine, that's all really well said. And I think the most striking point for me was what you were alluding to about the church's lack of basically setting apart the sacred from the profane. It's just become completely absorbed in the profane. And I think that is co-constitutive with the society that we're living in the sense that everything is so worldly, right? It goes without saying. That sounds like a very redundant point, but I'll elaborate. I think going back to what you were saying about choices and about how there's this mentality of, do what suits you, and then when it no longer suits you, move on. And it's essentially prioritizing the sensory or even the sensational quality of any ideology or religion over something which is far more transcendent than that, like salvation. So it is, you could say, sensation over salvation in that respect. And I think in that sense, it becomes very difficult growing up in this environment if you haven't inherited any tradition, if you're not comfortably set into that tradition from childhood and you're very familiar of its mores and customs and imaginal dimension of it too, if you don't have that exposure to the real depth or meaning of a tradition, then you will just inevitably be drawn to what gratifies you at any given time. And I think in that sense, I think maybe it's worth being kind of self-aware in this situation and saying that unfortunately, even each of us who are seeking in some way to return to tradition, as it were, we are postmodern subjects. And to get to where we are now, we have had to do a bit of picking and choosing, as much as we may criticize that in itself. And it's this notion of what Grace Davey called believing without belonging. And you alluded to that in the opening paragraph. So I think this is... It's inescapable, really. And in a way, even if you choose to return to tradition, so I can't take that seriously, but even if you choose to do that, it's still, in a sense, you are sort of choosing just one of many options in a sort of, as it's been called before, in a cafeteria of styles or an archive of styles, and you can pick and choose that way of life. It's not, in a sense, it's not truly traditional, because the very etymology of tradition is about having something handed down to you. It's about tradir means to give up. The whole notion imbued within tradition is that it's something that's given to you. It's not something that you're supposed to craft yourself and choose when you're 18 or having a midlife crisis. I'm not criticizing people who do that. Obviously, it's completely inevitable, but it's just an observation, really, that whether we like it or not, we're all postmodern subjects, and we have to go through a degree of that trying and testing and sampling and things.
I think that there is this kind of rupture that almost every single human being, I mean, unless you're, one of the North Sentinelese living in the Indian Ocean, there's a fundamental rupture between your world as it exists today and as it existed with your ancestors.
Yeah, and that really is an increasingly common phenomenon, that trivializing of religion to something which is usually a factor of politics or identity or culture even. I mean, I've seen it on both sides, actually, because on the one hand, I've noticed that a lot of sort of so-called conservative cultural commentators will often use the expression culturally Christian. They go sort of, oh, I'm culturally Christian. And what they mean by that is that they're clinging to the outward aesthetic trappings of Christendom, because, of course, that often has deeper meaning, sometimes associated with the empire, even sometimes, not always. And they don't actually commit to the ethical precepts of the religion, because usually they're not really conservative, they're more neoliberal, and you can't really reconcile the two. And then on the other hand, and something we were talking about a little bit before we started recording, was that you equally see this very interesting phenomenon of secular Muslims, and particularly on the terrain of identity politics. There is this growing trend of a lot of people reducing their religion to their identity or to their culture, and then utilizing that in a context of a political discourse, and sometimes even in more sort of Marxist discourse, sort of, as a Muslim, I am the oppressed, or things like that. And again, not to undermine that, but the point is that on both sides, whether you're a conservative Christian or a liberal Muslim, there is this reduction of religion to that very superficial level of identity and to the outward trappings. And I mean, this makes a lot of sense, given that really both of those camps, if you like, are ultimately have a very similar idea of progress, actually, and they have a very similar idea of secularism, really, one way or another, whether they'd admit that they share that same vision of secularism. And it seems that many religions will go that way, apart from, as we're already talking about, people such as yourselves who have returned to a more authentic religion, which is principled. And can I just say, it's really refreshing to see this. I think there certainly are a lot of live action role playing Catholics on Twitter. That certainly is true. But as you say, even if there may be some superficiality, at least there are some people who are actually going, no, this is deeper than this. The religion is actually about. It's not about identity. It's about so much more than that. And it's about going beyond your identity. It's about transcending that. Actually, I mean, going back to what you said at the beginning, Catherine. I mean, it's about sacrificing yourself, not asserting yourself, as we're seeing today.
Yeah, some of that reminded me of, like how religion has been lost in nations, and the trappings of consumerism. It reminded me of how lethal the concoction of the loss of chastity and sexual sin, combined with the lures of capital and money, how lethal those together are for nations. I mean, you have to look at Ireland recently, for example, where once everything pertaining to, the strongholds pertaining to chastity and to family were lost, at the same time as liberalization of the markets and growing wealth. Once those two things you're in harmony, the church they're like some of the biggest threats to the church, very underrated sources of persecution, really, because they're so subtle. And I'm sure, as Catherine will also attest to, the work of Eugene McCaraho is very interesting in his writing on the disenchanting of the world and like the desacralization of the world through the lures of consumerism, and and from the onset of, I'm sure not everyone agrees, but the onset of Protestantism, and how that kind of opened the door to liberalism. Then wealth is kind of the kind of Jacobin mindset that the market, is the ultimate god in the end.
So something that's really distinctive growing up in the UK is this culture of doubt and skepticism that we have. And I think that explains to some extent all of our journeys, in the sense of we've all felt there's some lack of authority in the traditions that we have been exposed to, if any. I think, Elena, that was what you were alluding to with Anglicanism. There was sort of present, but not really, didn't assert an authority, or clearly not one that was strong enough for you to feel inclined to follow it. And I think that's partly to do with the weakness of those authorities in the first place. As we've said, a lot of Anglicanism has sort of fallen into a state of profanity. That sounds very polemical. Sorry, I'm not really in a position to talk about Christian denominations. But anyway, that's sort of what we've been observing. So it is partly to do with that. It is partly to do with the fact that the religious infrastructure that does exist here just isn't really strong enough, with the exception, I think, of some Catholic communities. Those are definitely on the rise, as you all know firsthand and are living. But I think the other problem, and I think the bigger problem, is that as subjects growing up in the UK, regardless of what's going on around us, we don't really take well to any kind of authority. We doubt all kinds of authority. And some people might praise this as being a legacy of the great Enlightenment tradition of Hume. Obviously, I don't like Hume or the Enlightenment tradition. But I think it's true. It has left a huge legacy, and that's only actually become amplified through sort of Nietzschean thought, and also to an extent, sort of strains of Marxist thought, which are, undoubtedly present, particularly among younger generations. And all of these things combined, you've got that natural skepticism towards authority, which we just have innately, it seems, as British people. And then this more push towards it, especially in current discourses where it's like, no, you should question the traditions, you should challenge them. So all of these forces, none of them encourage you to align with the tradition. It's all doubt. That's the thing. It's doubt everything. And this is reflected quite interestingly in I saw a really interesting graph the other day. There's somebody on Twitter called Ryan Burge, and he makes pretty interesting graphs usually to do with religion and public life. And he made a graph, and it was what percentage of people from different generations believe in God without a doubt. And unsurprisingly, it was only about 30% of Gen Zs said they believed in God without a doubt. Now, firstly, I don't know exactly where this data is collected. I assume it was the Anglosphere.
No, Burge is a very adept American sociologist, as well as an American Baptist. He's a liberal Baptist preacher himself.
Ah, right. Yeah. So I didn't actually know the background. I just see lots of these graphics on Twitter. So thank you for informing me of that. But I think the key thing for me when I read that statistic, I wasn't surprised, only 30% of Gen Zs believe in God. For me, what was interesting was believing in God without a doubt. So what that shows is that, 70% of these people interviewed, they are infected with this real doubt, which I think proves sort of what I was trying to say.
Do you all believe in God without a doubt?
Sorry, say that again, please.
Do you believe in God without a doubt?
Unfortunately, well, these days, I don't.
Without a doubt, without a single doubt.
These days, yes, I do believe in God without a doubt. But when I was younger, I myself was infected by that doubt because as I was trying to convey earlier, I and none of us are immune from this default secularism and skepticism.
Without a doubt,
I say yes, because whenever I do have a small doubt, the tiniest doubt, I am instantly. It's rectified. Something will happen. It's really.
You have a doubt.
So mate. No, but the point is that even if there's like a.
No, this is interesting though, because I think this is actually very interesting about this whole post-Enlightenment culture reality. Catherine, do you believe without a doubt?
Yeah.
No, I totally believe with doubts.
But
I can't believe that you're all telling me that you don't have any doubts.
I'm open to doubting, and I allow myself to doubt, but it doesn't anymore hold any kind of purchase to me. It's immediately sort of rectified, long-term, short-term. I'm very fortunate to feel that way, obviously. And who knows, I might go through a great spiritual, a great sort of dark night of the soul to come. But I can confidently say that I do believe in God without a doubt.
I suppose that's true for me as well. Like, I don't really doubt God's existence. I think that I am going to hell a lot. So, like, I doubt myself. Like, I think I'm definitely going to hell, at least for a while, But, like, as a universalist, it's not, it's not a total, like, maybe I'll go to hell for 100,000 years, or 1,000,000 years. But I'm not going to be lost forever. So there is some kind of hope there.
Is it not, a tenet of Orthodox mysticism in a way to live in hell but without despair? Is that not part of the...
I suppose. I mean, I guess we're all in hell already.
I've certainly seen that.
And to kind of assume yourself to be on the path to hell is healthy for a Christian aiming for and aspiring to perfection.
Sorry, Henry, do you feel like believing that about yourself purifies yourself in some kind of way? Does it morally instruct you to be?
Without getting too personal,
Of course.
like, I'm a man, and I have all of the foibles and failures of a man. My sin is never, it's not like hard to understand what my sins are. I mean, it's very obvious. So, in a sense, I'm kind of just a crass, fleshly being. I'm not very spiritual, but I would prefer to be. But at the same time, I would prefer not to be. It's a kind of, I mean, now we're getting really into the concept of hell, but I really believe with St. Isaac of Nineveh, the Qatari mystic and subject of the first episode of Forms, that hell and paradise are subjective conditions of God's presence, and that the all-consuming fire of God shall be all in all, as St. Paul says, and that the suffusion of God's presence, right, to those who love him will be experienced as the true love that it is, and to those who hate him will be a kind of a torment, right? And, on the last day, I don't know on what side I will stand, right? As I said, I'm a universalist, so I believe that eventually every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and that all shall be reconciled to God, and that evil really will be overcome. I truly believe that. I truly believe that, even the devil and his angels shall be, repent and be redeemed. But I might be there with the devil and his angels at the last wave of people to be like, okay, God, I love you, because I just don't live it. I don't live it to that degree. And that's just the realities. I don't love my neighbor as I love myself.
If I may, I would say that the sort of things that you're talking about are the sort of things that obviously I think affect the vast majority of Christians, not living up to the standard of which they see as perfection. It is not to get too personal here, but by that logic, do you sort of, I suppose, believe that the majority of even sort of practicing Christians who obviously fall short are destined to the same kind of idea that you have for yourself?
I have no idea. I mean, my perspective is very simple. Like, I think we live in perhaps the most evil of all ages of human life. When I consider what is the United States of America, Temujin, when he led the horde, they had to butcher men, women, and children by hand. How many people could you butcher with a knife by hand in a day? I think there's a real limit there. I think you could not just, do 1,000 people yourself. I mean, you would be tired. Your arm would be tired. How many throats can you really cut, right? Americans can send a small team of men and glass a city in an instant, right? The amount of evil that is present in the American empire is completely without precedent. So when I think about the present, I just think that we're lost in a kind of dark age of unconscionable evil. And I'm a definite participant in that. I don't know what more to say than that. I just feel like this sort of the evil of the present age is so extreme that I don't know who can stand. I mean, if you read the Psalms, it's very clear, who can sit upon the mount of the Lord, who can sit upon the holy hill, even he that leadeth an uncorrupt life, right? Who leads an uncorrupt life?
I have a few friends currently retreating to the religious life, enclosed cloisters, and I think they have realised this. They've realised that it is extraordinarily difficult to attain to perfection, and without doing so, and I mean, not to be too, be too personal again, but I felt that way. I felt as if I ought to do that soon after I converted, to avoid the snares of the world and to attain to perfection. But then there have been times when I've been arrogantly thinking, I pray, a rosary as much as I can, and I do this and that. I say, all right, I'm all right here in the world. But then it kind of strikes me that actually, I have such a long way to go as still. So the world is very difficult because not only do we have the temptations, but we also have distractions. And I think the distractions are sometimes worse, like a worse obstacle for attaining perfection, because sometimes the temptations can be purifying, but the distractions can simply, be a real snare that we underestimate. So I think this will increase among people who are believing. There will be perhaps more people who become hermits and cloistered as a percentage of Christians than there are now. in the future, because it'll be so difficult to live in the world.
I think that'd be an incredible blessing. I mean, I have spent relatively limited amount of time among monks and nuns, but when we look at forms of life available today to people, the monastic form of life is a really strong contender, and I hope it makes.
Well, I think it's as you've been touching on, it's not surprising really, because it does feel like you have to do one extreme or the other, because the current climate is just not conducive to spiritual progress, and you do think, well, perhaps the answer is to completely seal yourself off, because it's just left, right, and centre. There are, as we said earlier, I actually just want to qualify the question about doubting the existence of God, because for me, I don't doubt the existence of God. I don't. However, I do sometimes doubt to what extent should my consciousness of God be involved in my life. I think that's the biggest struggle for me. Sometimes, you go through time. Even this, maybe this is. I actually have been wanting to discuss this with people for a while. So sometimes I feel very guilty about listening to music, and I have this. I think one of my. It's not really a vice, because I don't think it's bad for me as such, but I will often just here's some music, and I will start kind of dancing and be very animated, and I feel guilty about it. I think I felt almost like I was worshipping the song, or I was worshipping the experience of almost that kind of ecstatic, and I think perhaps in that respect I'm sort of influenced by certainly some quite what you might call kind of Puritan readings of Islam, perhaps, and also there's a really fantastic articulation of this concept by Seraphim Rose, and this notion of prelest. It's not his term, of course, but he talks about it a lot, and it's this idea of being lured in by these sensations and by these sensory stimulations, basically, and treating those as being spiritual experiences. I'm incredibly wary of that, and I think, to go back to that question you asked, because it is very relevant to what we were just saying, the modern world presents so many of these opportunities for prelest, for these sensory distractions, to the extent where it becomes very hard. Not only it becomes hard to follow religious life, but it becomes really hard to actually work out, well, how do you mediate a religious life, even if you're set on living one? How do you mediate that with things which you've been taught from a very young age are good for you because they're pleasurable?
Mm-hmm. But I think it's important not to conflate modernity with this sort of crass hedonism of popular culture. I mean, you look at Hunt or Rossetti or any of these men and their paintings, right? The awakening conscience, when she looks through the window, what is she looking at? What is awakening her conscience? It's the tree. It's nature itself. A simple rejection of modernity won't do, right? That's no solution at all. We have to be able to take what's good from the French philosophe and move forward with the good, rejecting the bad. And I think when you think about music, for example, I mean, look at the Psalms. The Psalms are full of music, right? I think there is something really true in that and something important.
Esme, it's really interesting what you were saying about listening to music, because I remember when I was about 19 or 20 or so, talking to a young woman from the Islamic Society at university. And I remember having this conversation with her, and she was like, I'm from a Muslim family, but it's only over the past year that I've become really, truly devout. And I was talking to her about what prompted this. And she said, I was just obsessed with listening to music, just constantly. I love listening to music. I did it all the time. It took up a huge amount of my time. It was a huge distraction for me. I loved it, And I turned around and I realised I wasn't paying enough time with my family or with God or with this or that.
We actually had a lunch on Sunday, which was a real combination of people. We called it a Neoplatonist lunch. Esme was there. I don't know if she would actually identify as a Neoplatonist, but we had Esme, and then we had some Protestants and Catholics, and
but that was actually a first for me, in the sense of actually instigating, a meetup with, how many of us were there? Like 10. That's kind of, I think that was probably the first time that I've actually done something like that and actually been with a large group of people like that. Because again, I'm very sort of self-aware about saying this, because I'm aware I often do criticize the sort of atomized nature of modernity, but alas, I can't help the fact that actually is kind of the case in terms of how I interact with people and how I reach out to different faiths and how I have dialogues with them. It does tend to be very, very online, as they say. And I think I think that's the hardest part, and it's another aspect of what I was touching on earlier about the lack of authority of a given tradition, because it's so easy to just algorithmically kind of swing to different traditions and to different communities online. Hence, you get all this laughing, and we don't really have those organic communities. And I think that's been the hard. I mean, in terms of me settling into a tradition, which as sad as it is, I don't think I have. I think that the main reason for that is just that lack of grounding, and everything being so liquid, as we talked about last time, Henry, with the sort of liquid modernity and the nature of the internet. And of course, the internet's been a huge influence in detraditionalization, because it reduces things to streams of information and images which just fly by you, and there's no permanence there, and hence it's really not conducive to forming those stable organic communities. This is obviously quite obvious. This isn't that wasn't supposed to be a particularly profound observation. It's just something that's undoubtedly been a huge hindrance for me personally.
For Catherine and Alina, to what degree does the Catholic faith rise above a mere set of propositions and actually become something of a form of life? To what degree do you have a real community there?
I would say certainly in London there is a real community of young Catholics who are traditionally minded. I sometimes find it even overwhelming how many of us there are, and how often we would cross paths. And I think there is something really emerging. I think perhaps there's just a lack of, especially during the last year, of course, a lack of infrastructure in place for us to kind of do something very proactive together. But we obviously, I suppose, live in a communal way, and I think the internet does help to foster that. But perhaps we could, for me, my observation is that we have so much community, but we're not doing enough with it at the moment. So we need to, be being salt and light on earth more together. So I think communities I don't find is lacking. I know in other parts of the country it is, but
I think my biggest question, not just to you, but just generally, is, do you think that we will start seeing a pushback against this? Because I often hear people joking about forming, as you did earlier, about buying a village in France or something, and actually turning that community into a really embodied one. And I know, among certain communities, there is this sort of almost kind of, we're gonna start a commune, and I have a friend who uses the expression Christianity, and basically starting a kind of kibbutz type thing and I think a lot of these things are very easy to say this when you're in a group chat, but I'm really curious as to, as things get more difficult, I think, for people who are of religion, and without getting too political, I think that may actually become a problem in terms of religious freedom.
Well, before Alina and Catherine respond, I should say that there are a number of French communes that have existed for multiple decades at this point and are quite successful. So, whether it's Yellow Vest or the Notav movement or the ZAD or any of these other things, there are real contestations that occur.
That's lovely and really refreshing and quite inspiring, actually, that people are it's not just thoughts, it's also actions.
It's I wouldn't say it's the majority of people by any means, but you go to the French elite universities, and there's a cadre of people that say, there's no future for us in this dead society. This doesn't work.
You may have heard of an article that was published in The Atlantic a while ago called St. Mary's, Kansas and Christian Withdrawal. And it's describing a community attached to the international society that I kind of attend, which is the Society of St. Pius X. And so this article is talking about a place in Kansas, which I think is serving as both an example and adjacent to it happening elsewhere in the world. But I think this is the biggest example currently, whereby many families have gathered together around the Society of St. Pius X, and they're now actually constructing a huge multi-million-pound, I think basilica kind of church, actually. There are so many families, and the chapels were overflowing. There wasn't enough room to accommodate them. I'm sure Americans will be able to offer more insight, but I think that serves as an example of the way things are going, and obviously it prompted enough attention to, for the Atlantic to cover it. And I think it's particularly an issue which I'm sure you're starting to learn with education. I have so many Christian friends who are involved in or seeking to establish classical education projects, whether that's physically or online to begin with. So I think a lot of these communities are forming because they realise the threat that even homeschooling will be regulated at some point. And, what the state curriculum is offering is obviously not something they want to feed their children. So I think the main prompt at the moment is education, but I think it will be an attraction for everyone before long.
I think it's very interesting that people from various political positions are landing upon this strategy of destitution of institutions, of saying that we need to just, pull out to whatever degree that we can of, as you say, the education system or whatever, and try to establish some kind of autonomous base. What do you make of this, Catherine?
I think that just going back to what Esme was saying about the idea of you have this sort of idea, especially online, and a lot of online communities will let's set up like a commune or a kibbutz or some kind of homestead or something. And then you have the reality, especially in Britain and the like, of Christianity slowly becoming, going from sort of unfashionable to being considered sort of hatred to maybe being persecuted actively in the future. And then Esme kind of asked the question, does this idea of the kibbutz or homestead or retreat from the world kind of become reality at this point? If I'm understanding you correctly, Esme.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting about that is it's basically the Benedictine option, right? The idea that if Christians have a real kind of sense of community, and that's the big if, I suppose, is it in real life? Can it be put into practice, or is it simply sort of like theory and dreams and LARPing or whatever? And they find themselves actively persecuted. Do they go out into the world and try to evangelize and convince others? Can they go up against sort of like mighty imperial Rome? Can they go up against 21st century secular Britain? Or do they retreat from it almost entirely with their own sort of monastic communities? And I think that as some Christians will maybe be swayed, because it's very easy to be swayed from Christianity, because as we say, Christianity isn't pleasure-based and the world is. I think as some Christians will be convinced by the world and will sort of almost fall to modernity, I think in this, I don't mean to sound sort of like dystopian science fiction, but in this possible outcome in which Christianity is sort of actively persecuted, I do think that there's a very, 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 very real chance of monastic communities just thriving as a result of it. I think that matches up quite well.
I think fundamentally, just to respond to that question about the Benedict option, I think Rod Dreher fundamentally misunderstands St. Benedict. And for those listening that want a fuller treatment of this topic, I would really recommend the book The Way of St. Benedict by former Archbishop Rowan Williams himself. Gets into this question, because I think Dreher, well, without getting too deep into it, I think Dreher's sort of vision is very scattered and not really coherent, whereas Williams really concentrates on what did St. Benedict and his rule actually consist in. And one of the key parts of the Benedictine rule is this concept of being dedicated to a place, right? You commit to a place. And when I think about Christianity, as far as I understand, the Christian religion promotes two forms of asceticism for every human being. One form of asceticism is the higher form, which is this sort of monastic or self-denial where you dedicate yourself to a place. That's kind of historically how it's played out. The other form is sort of lesser, but in a sense easier and more common, which is to dedicate yourself to another person. And that would be like marriage, right? So I dedicate myself to my wife, and in that I sort of take up an ascetic task. But when I dedicate myself to a person, it's easier for a number of reasons. Dedicating yourself to a place, that's a really hard line. But I think in a sense it's actually truer. And I agree with you in the sense that I think that over time, Christians will need to reappropriate this ascetic vision. I mean, in American evangelicalism, at least, there's this kind of hedonist trend of saying that, God made marriage for sex, for pleasure, for all these things, right? Whereas if you read St. Paul, that is not at all his vision, right?
Or St. Jerome even. I think more people need to read St. Jerome's letter against Joannes. I mean, that's very radical, and I think it would make St. Paul seem very light to address. Yeah, I certainly agree to the extent that, where there's been decadence and abandonment of the essence of the faith, and, abandonment of asceticism and of, the very deposit of faith in terms of how we live. I mean, that is a punishment from God, when they have collapsed as a result, and it's inevitable. Well, today is the feast of Saint Dominic, who founded the Order of Friars Preachers, and his approach was to, go around in humility, showing our humility, to be going around barefooted, armored with the truth. And I think we do need to return to that. We need to return to simply, I mean, he's obviously characterized often in contrast to the Franciscans, but in reality, all of the successful religious orders have had humility and the witness to virtue at their core. And yeah, I think as Christians, we do need to focus less on our rhetoric and more on our witness, because that has been a big lack, as we see. And as I said to people many times before, I think most of the triumph of error is as a result of Christians responding to error uncharitably, or just in a way that is not acknowledging of human dignity and imago Dei. So I think witness, as you were saying, has to be at the heart of how we return souls to Christ.
I think that there's a great lack of love in our society, and there's a great lack of charity, and there's a huge amount of ego and cruelty in the world. I know that I'm very egotistical and I'm very cruel, and I see that a lot in the world and in the country that I live in. And I think that Pope Francis's success is the fact that it's born of his overwhelming and entirely endearing and moving love. I think the man radiates love. I think the man radiates charity. And that's far more successful in convincing people, even opening the tiniest crack into a closed-off heart to allow the light in, is just love and charity. And it always has been. And when we try to sort of overwhelm people, again, Esme sort of mentioned this before we started recording, obviously Islam has there's no compulsion in Islam. And I'd say that that's practically true when we look at when Islam tries to recruit via force. It's often not as successful as it is when it recruits via love. I'd say it's exactly the same with Catholicism. And it's Christ's message. Christ's message is love. It's convincing. It works. It might sound entirely twee, but it can bring down empires. And when we sort of go barefoot into the world and humble ourselves and give instead of sort of consume, I think that we live a far more Christian life, a far better life, a far more loving life, and a far more convincing life to others.
It reminds me of a quotation which I often researched into its validity, and as far as I can tell, I think it is valid, which is from Napoleon Bonaparte, which was, Alexander, Caesar, Charlemagne, and I founded empires, but on what did we rest the creations of our genius? Upon force. Jesus Christ founded his empire upon love, and at this hour millions of people would die for him. And I think this comes back to Henry's point about, Christianity is, in a sense, a death cult. And what ultimately matters is how we are at the end of our life. And love is what leads us to being in the perfect state. And love is more powerful in leading souls towards that as well.
It's really interesting for me to hear two people who are sincere in their beliefs, because there is a lot of superficiality on the internet, as we've touched on. And so, even though I may not share the same theology as you and the same views as you, I think that's what is so important. Just to hear that, to have these conversations and to be orientated around these principles that we do fundamentally share.